okay in the room? Okay.
Merle, are we ready?
Yep.
I just want to welcome the folks that are joining us online. Kind of exciting. I think everyone in the room knows that we are doing many, in fact, I think we're now doing all of our educational programs, providing an opportunity for patients, families, caregivers, professionals to join us no matter where they are in the country. We're very excited and very proud of that. The Living Well programs are monthly programs that we do not only in Milwaukee, but we also host quarterly sessions in the greater Madison area, but also broadcast those. So you might see, if you leave us your email, you'll see notices about various programs that we do. March is Kidney Month next month, so we're actually adding some very interesting programs that relate to also part of our mission in terms of creating awareness just about overall kidney health and prevention. So next month you'll see us, and please feel free to pass that along. We're doing a special program on women and kidney health as part of World Kidney Day, and we'll be doing a special program with the New School of Pharmacy here at the Medical College, again for the general public that has really maybe not as much awareness about, let's say, over-the-counter pain medications, supplements, and how that might affect kidney health. We're also working again next month with our friends at Freighter also on a program for people considering becoming an altruistic donor for perhaps someone they don't know in terms of donating. So you'll see a lot of programs that we do, and please know that you're always invited and welcome to come to anything that we do. But we're grateful for those folks that have joined us online. You'll be able to ask questions, and then they'll be repeated to us here in the room. Jenessa will repeat those. Those of you in the room, just speak if you can with a little bit of a playground voice, but Dr. Price will repeat those. But since February is Heart Month, we talked a little bit because I heard Dr. Price speak at another patient event that we did for dialysis patients in October, and I was blown away by
thank you.
Her presentation. But I think what you'll discover tonight is her compassion and her real commitment to bringing not only information to people, but I think helping bring joy to lives. I know she did that in October, and I was especially excited that she agreed to come tonight. So Dr. Price.
Thank you. Thanks to the National Kidney Foundation for having me, and for everyone that's present in the room and online as well. I'm really excited about this topic because, as you'll kind of see, I really get very passionate about the idea of not only how we can use our behaviors and our thoughts to help improve our own emotional experience, but this talk is kind of cool because it also is a great way to reflect on the things that we're already doing that impact others, but how we can really reflect on that and think about gratitude and how it impacts ourselves at the same time. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch for giving to others and really taking some things that are meaningful for yourself. So, I'll use this. I'm having trouble moving slides here. You have them in. Okay, probably. Okay, there we go. So to introduce myself to everybody online, again, I'm Jenessa Price. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I'm a transplant psychologist at Freighter and the Medical College of Wisconsin. I actually cover working with our kidney patients and our heart patients just by organ population. So kind of lucked out tonight that I'm meeting with everyone here in the room. And just no disclosures to discuss before this talk. So the plan for today, I wanted to actually define happiness and define kindness, and encourage everybody to think flexibly about those definitions, because we don't necessarily always think about what that can encompass and why it's important. And I think by the end of the talk today, you'll have a sense of why it is important to think flexibly about these terms. And also thinking about kindness in terms of how we're kind to both ourselves in addition to doing those things that we do for others, the general definition of kindness. And then I really want to also focus on recognizing the things that we're already doing every day that promote kindness and well-being, but also recognizing those places where we can potentially need it the most and how we can kind of bump up those either behaviors or reflections that we do to improve our emotional experience. So when you talk about happiness as a psychologist, you have to talk about Seligman. He is the guru of happiness in our field. And theoretically, he kind of created in the 1990s this complete shift in the way that we think about psychology and psychological function. Because for the longest time it was, okay, well, what's wrong? Okay, someone's depressed, someone's anxious, someone's really stressed out. And he kind of got the idea to look at the big picture and say, yeah, there are some folks that struggle with that. A lot of us do. And there are some people that are kind of doing okay despite things that are going on. You know, who are these folks that are walking around, you know, reporting that they're doing well or reporting that they're happy, even in the context of having some situations that are really stressful? And so he created this field of positive psychology, studying people who report happiness and trying to see what's working for them. And so when we think about happy people, well, let's start with happiness itself. So happiness is subjective, right? When we're happiness, we're asking people to self-report. So first things first with defining happiness, I can't walk down the street and tell you who's happy. Like, we can't look at people and just because someone's smiling at me doesn't mean that they're happy. It means they're smiling, right? So again, really subjectively thinking about one's own emotions. But it's actually more than just emotion. Happiness also encompasses things like, you know, how you feel about yourself, your own self-confidence and your self-esteem, feeling actualized, which is kind of a fancy word of saying at some point we grow up and become adults and we have to like ourselves and feel like we're getting things out of life. And actually that kind of quality of life picture. So how much do you really enjoy your life and the things that are going on in it? And how much does that mean back to you? And this idea of gratitude as well, that we can really reflect and think about the things that we have, even in the presence of the things that we maybe don't have or have lost. And so when we actually look at happy people, people who define themselves as happy in subjective report, we see that they tend to have better social relationships. They have more pleasant kind of everyday activities. They report lots of good things that are going on and enjoying even sometimes the neutral things like grocery shopping or the things that we might take for granted. And maybe some people can speak up later about having lost some of those neutral things during times when you've been ill or when you've been in the hospital and what it means to get back to that normal lifestyle. But we also see that they're more extroverted. They're the people that are more likely to kind of get out, introduce themselves to others, make relationships or connections, and then utilize those relationships and connections in terms of a social relationship. So because it's Valentine's Day, and then I'm a psychologist, which means I like the brain, but we're talking about Valentine's Day, which really brings up the heart. We kind of have this discussion in our culture that, you know, our emotions come from the brain, but love and do-goodedness really comes from the heart, right? But there's evidence that it's really symbiotic. So the heart itself can actually affect our emotion, right? So I kind of always use the example that if somebody made me run on a treadmill and watch a horror movie, I would be pretty scared. And it would happen pretty quickly for me. Because sometimes our bodily functions like, you know, blood pressure or heart rate or sweating or, you know, breathing really shallow or really heavily can make us feel anxious, for example. And in turn, we can kind of control our breathing and feel a little bit calmer. But it actually goes way beyond that. And so I was just talking with someone about some new things that I learned as a psychologist in the medical literature for a long time. Our heart has its own endocrine system, which is a system that makes hormones. And actually that hormone system plays into our nervous system. So it's called ANF is what the hormone is, and it's mood influencing. It can kind of act on the system that tells us to do the fight or flight, right? So you need to kind of prepare, and your body needs to get out of a scary situation. And then later, the parasympathetic nervous system will kind of rest and repair. That's that kind of, oh my gosh, I can't believe that car almost went into my lane. I can't believe that I shifted the wheel and got out of that. And so we kind of think about the brain making some of those decisions or being involved in that, but actually our heart can inform that as well. And so that's that difference between the calming sort of thoughts that can happen and excitatory kinds of thoughts. And the coolest way that we've learned about this in some ways, from what I've been reading, has been from heart transplant patients. So, some of our heart recipients have noted kind of a little bit of a change in personality, that when they've been able to dig and learn a little bit about their donors, they've learned, I'm kind of more calm these days. And then I heard that my donor was really more of a placid person. Or I've even had people tell me, and I wasn't able to answer it, but now I feel like I kind of can, I'm starting to like different foods. And that's different for me since my heart transplant. And so part of the idea behind it is that heart-brain connection, that there are particular messengers that happen in the heart that can inform our brain, and it can inform the excitatory kinds of feelings and thoughts, as well as the calming kinds of thoughts and feelings. So when I think about the heart-brain connection, my first thought as a psychologist is, okay, that's awesome that I know this now. How can we use that? How can we manipulate that connection to really inform what our emotional experience can look like? And so what I want to do is present some more information and then come back to this idea at the end. All right, so then let's talk about kindness then. How do we define kindness? Our culture kind of define it in a way of being a good person, right? A good in quotations person. So doing something for others, we tend to say that we're doing something out of the goodness of our hearts, right? Thinking about others before ourselves, putting good out into the world. And we also tend to ascribe to these societal norms of what kindness should look like. So I'm originally from the Midwest, and I know we've got some people online from other parts of the country, but one of the things I noticed when I lived in Boston for a period of time was I was kind of thrown because it wasn't as much door opening and door holding. And it was something that I really recognized right away, or the saying thank you in response to that, which looking back on it now, there were plenty of nice and kind people I met in Boston, but it was this idea of the cultural norms that sometimes can shift. And if you think about transplant in particular, the entire culture, your lifestyle has completely shifted. There's a lot that's changed and a lot that kindness can sort of weigh on. So think about, caregiver stress or caregiver burden, or on the flip side, being a patient and feeling like, you want to get back out and do those things that are important to you and you want to give back. So this idea that our cultures actually can change over time in terms of kindness. But the one thing that all of these ideas really take into account is a focus on action, right? It's the things that we're doing. I can think as hard as I want about being kind, but it doesn't necessarily change anything that's going on around me. You kind of have to get active and you have to do it. And so that's a really important piece that I want everyone to take with them, is that we're going to focus on behaviors, the things we can actually do. So let's kind of do the relations. And it's, again, this really symbiotic relationship where, happiness informs kindness and kindness informs happiness. And, we'll talk about it later. We kind of don't really know what comes first. They both kind of play on each other. So several studies have actually looked at this. And what they've found is that happy people report having more happy memories during the day. So people who rate themselves as feeling pretty happy tend to also talk about having more happy memories. They can come up with more things to count. And they actually define those as being really meaningful. So the quality of those memories is more in terms of the intensity and the meaningfulness that they can report. They also have more recognition of the kindness that they're doing. So they're kind of walking around recognizing when they're doing these things that are kind. And it actually looks like it leads to more motivation. So they feel more motivated to continue that kind of action. And they report subjectively these better relationships with people. So again, people like, loved ones, family and friends, but, we touch a lot of people during the day. We have acquaintances, we have neighbors, we have people that we might just happen to pass on our way to a doctor's appointment, for example. So a lot of better relationships that they can report. And then if we, as scientists, kind of turn it around and say, all right, well, I know what that group looks like, the people that are in my study, but what are they doing? How can I look at the variable of kindness? There's relationships that come from there as well, right? Because it's that symbiotic relationship. So actually counting more kindness acts led to people reporting more happiness. So doing that action more helped people feel happier. And then in turn, that sort of increased more kindness and actually gratitude. So gratitude being the idea that not only can you do an action, but you can sit and reflect and think about that positive psychology kind of picture. So even if there are bad things present, or even if there's just neutral things present going on in my life, I can really feel and express some gratitude for the things that are going on. So the act of just engaging in kindness, just by action, can be really, really important for happiness. But we don't really do a great job of thinking about all the ways we can characterize kindness. And there's sort of a shift in the literature about what kindness truly is. So for a long, long time, and to this day, we really think about kindness as words like altruism, right? Like having this inherent need to want to do good and not necessarily expecting anything in return. And psychologists also call kindness pro-social behavior, right? That sounds super scientific and not very people-oriented at all, but the idea that I do things to be social and to get sort of some positive feedback behind that. And there's been studies that have been conducted, meta-analyses, and what that is, they pile all the studies together that look at a particular subject. Here they were looking at pro-social behavior versus the kindness that you kind of do just for yourself. And what they found was kindness towards others tended to result in better outcomes versus people that did kindness just for themselves. So things like, noticing more positive emotions if you're doing those kindness actions for others, noticing that you kind of start out with less negative emotions, those that go on to do those kindness actions towards others. And actually, this improved what they called psychological flourishing. So beyond emotions, people feeling more gratitude, feeling more compassion, feeling more actualized in terms of how they're spending their day. So again, a lot of literature supporting how important pro-social and doing kindness for others kinds of behaviors can be in terms of your own emotional experience, which sounds kind of selfish, right? Because then you're kind of doing some kind things and getting some things from that in terms of emotional experience and feeling good psychologically. But there's a time and a place to be kind to yourselves, right? And anyone who's ever struggled with family relationships, romantic relationships, or perhaps, feeling really pulled in many directions because of parenting or challenges in a family relationship, or needing to kind of be the caregiver, can recognize the importance of being kind to yourself. And I think this is especially important in the context of, the foundation that we're talking to today, as well as the people in the room and the people present online, is that we've got a lot of patients themselves as well as caregivers who have really flourished through caregiver support. And so thinking about being able to be kind to yourself is very important. So we're actually getting back towards this model in some ways in terms of the research that's being done, and also in pop culture. There's a lot of talk about mindfulness. Have people heard that word thrown around? So, you know, it's this Eastern model that really encompasses compassion. So like Buddhist kinds of spirituality, yoga, and mindfulness, really thinking about not only taking care of yourself and your health, deep breathing, but thinking in a compassion perspective. You know, compassion towards others, but also compassion towards yourself. And what that's really getting to, this compassion perspective, is this idea of, you know, thinking about your own experience in the context of all of humanity. And, you know, this is something that I always have to do. I always bring up traffic, but I always have to do this in traffic. Is I'm only one of, you know, hundreds of cars on this highway in this moment, or thousands of cars driving right now in this moment. And, you know, my experience is tough, and I'm sure that there are others that might be feeling that way too. And then getting back to gratitude. Really show gratitude, right? I can't do an action of gratitude. I can kind of do an action of kindness, right? I can give some help, but I have to really sit and reflect and think about my own unique experience to reflect upon gratitude. And so that's where this self-compassion can come in, and, you know, balancing the behavior of doing kindness towards others with taking some time to really sit and reflect for yourself. And you're the only person in your shoes. Nobody else knows what your experience has been like. So gratitude really comes back to a very personal thought process for each of us. And then just the idea of self-care, you know, and this is stuff that any psychologist, therapist, social worker can talk about with you. The idea that a lot of the kindness that we can give to ourselves can be pretty simple. And it's known to be used in the idea of stress reduction. So taking deep breaths. We're going to talk about some self-care tips and tricks later on in the talk. But also the idea of, you know, really maintaining where you're at. So it's kind of like the idea of, I can't train for a marathon the night before. I've got to really do some maintenance training leading up to that. So taking very good care of yourself here and there along the way so that you're set up for success. Okay, so coming back to that relationship between happiness and kindness. You know, I don't know if it's really excessive. That's what a lot of the scientific literature talks about, you know, that we're going to look at people who do kindness to other people, and then we're going to look at people who do kindness towards themselves, and we're going to compare them. And that's great for a scientific study, but I would argue that sometimes we're kind and we get something out of it, you know, both in terms of giving to others as well as taking time for ourselves. And sometimes taking time for ourselves means we're actually kind to others, right? If we take those 5 minutes to relax before we, you know, spend some time with our kids or our partners, right? So there's also this idea of, you know, what comes first? Are happy people more kind, or people who do kindness happier, or is it both? And I think it's a little bit of both. But they're very closely connected. And I think the best example is, you know, think about the holidays. As soon as I say holidays, I immediately think, oh, stress. Like, I need to make my lists for gifts. I need to budget things. I need to make sure I don't forget anyone. But that best feeling is on that moment that you give a gift to someone that you really care about, and you kind of wait and see if they like it when they open it. And we kind of reflect back on those moments and recognize, you know, I really enjoyed giving the gift more than receiving, even if it was a great gift, something that I really wanted. And that, to me, is this idea of that mutual relationship that can exist with kindness and happiness, right? So the heart-brain connection, back to the question. How much can we manipulate our actions, right? Our behaviors, the things that we do, and our thoughts to be able to optimize that connection? Now, I'm not going to argue that we're going to increase all the endorphins and hormones that are coming out of our heart and our brain that are talking to each other. But knowing that that exists, how can we sort of optimize the things that we do day to day to get the most out of our own experience? So let's talk about some ideas. The ideas being stuff that's really, really simple and occurring every single day. I know we've got some fantastic volunteers here who put a lot of time towards things that they're really passionate about. And I would also encourage everyone to think about what you're already doing day to day. So where these kindness behaviors already exist for you. You know, maybe it's situational. You know, we've got people who are really excited and love their job, but are noticing they're having challenges in terms of a personal life or at home, or people who are kind of in the flip, looking for a job or looking for something that makes them feel like they're getting what they need. Or maybe it's time of day. I am not a very nice morning person, and so I have to work very, very hard on myself in the mornings, and so we can kind of talk about some of my own personal tips and tricks. But I'd be interested in hearing from you guys. You know, what are times of days that you struggle with, and how can we talk about the model that I'll bring up? And then, you know, where is this stuff lacking? And maybe it's the domain that's lacking. So maybe there's places in terms of your happiness that you'd like to build up. Maybe emotionally you're feeling like you're pretty stable, but you're really looking for that thing in life that means so much that you can kind of go to sleep at night and feel like you're meeting that thing. Or maybe it's self-confidence or self-esteem. And then, you know, feeling like you can break down where it's happening between the kindness that you give to others and the kindness that you work on for yourself. Meaning, you know, the caregiver stress model. We tell all of our caregivers, you need to really focus on having someone come in to help take care of your loved one so that you can have time to yourself. Or putting 5 or 10 minutes aside so that you can focus on the things that you need for self-care. Work burnout can be a huge one, right? So taking time even during the workday, for example, to work on your own emotional experience. Medical stress can also be a huge deal. So part of the everyday kindness model really starts with this idea of reflecting. So thinking about where things are going well, what more you would like out of life, and then how you can focus on one thing with kindness. And the third part being monitoring. So the monitor and the reflect really go together. Having that time to sit and reflect and cognitively be aware of where you're at. And then the second part being focusing on action and behavior. So the idea here is just giving yourself a truly relatable goal, something you can achieve easily, whether it's, you know, 5 minutes a day or a task a week, where you really practice kindness. Again, something in a place maybe where you're either lacking kindness or wanting to work on your own happiness. So for example, smiling at strangers as you walk down the street or walk in a hospital is a great place to go because everybody needs a smile in the hospital. And, you know, if you're going to your doctor's appointments, it's a great place to practice. Saying hello to people, even if you don't know them. Taking 5 minutes for self-care. This is actually a great place to improve your sleep as well, if you can put that 5 minutes towards one of the things we're going to talk about before bed, for example. Or maybe it's something that's a little bit bigger, like finally getting around to a volunteer opportunity or giving the help that you'd like to give to a loved one. I think the important thing with this is making sure that you can break it down into something that's really achievable and measuring it daily. So being your own scientist, we talk about N in science. So what's the sample size? We call it N, an N of 1, you know, so you're the case study, what works and what doesn't. And potentially seeking feedback from either if you've got, you know, some mental health professionals through a clinic that you can speak with, or a loved one that knows you really well and is going to be able to speak to how things are working for you. So reflecting, making a small change, and then monitoring and kind of looping back to see how your emotional experience feels. Okay, so tips and tricks. Let's start with the things that we can do towards others, right? Kindness to others, pro-social behavior. I'm going to start with these bolded ones because I think that they're some of the easiest things to build into your day. So again, saying hello to acquaintances or even strangers, or asking someone how their day is. The thing people love best is to talk about themselves. So it's a great way to build a relationship, but it's also a great way to practice having more connections and trying and using kindness. So maybe someone in the office that you haven't checked in with in a while, and taking a couple minutes to practice that. The basics, so things like holding a door, making eye contact when you say thank you for someone else holding the door, letting others in your lane on the highway. This is one that I'm still struggling with sometimes, especially in the mornings when I'm really, really mad. But I have to remind myself, you know, this is something that is helping you. It's not helping the other person. It might help them gain a couple seconds, but it's really helping me more. Or offering your seat. So if you're in a space where, you know, you can see that someone else might benefit from having that seat. And accepting thank you, because people inevitably will thank you when you do these things. And making that eye contact and saying you're welcome can also feel really, really good and bring about some happiness. Sending a supportive text or an email. Again, we're already doing these kinds of things, but if you can, you know, reflect on maybe this is someone I've lost contact with, or I know this person's having a hard time. I wonder if it would be helpful if they were to receive a message, and practicing that behavior, the action in that way. And then, you know, the things that maybe might take a little bit more time and might be several steps in terms of that breaking things down and practicing. So asking someone if they need help. Maybe there's a neighbor or a family member that you know is having a tough time getting around, snow removal, yard work coming up, thinking about how you want to use your time, and really the last part here, thinking about what you really value or who you really appreciate, and using that as a jumping point to identify something kind to do. Typically, when we act in line with our values, we tend to be happier because we feel like we're meeting the things that are important to us. So that's the tips and tricks towards being kind to others. But let's talk about being kind to yourselves. And I know I talked about, you know, 5 minutes here or there, but some of these can even be done in a second. So one of the best skills is to focus on the 5 senses, because there's really no thinking that comes up during those, right? I don't have to think about how to smell, I just smell. So vision, for example, it can be things like buying some flowers and really appreciating what they look like. This is a time of year, I think, where it's really important sometimes to have some flowers sitting on the table so you can get through winter. Here in Wisconsin, at least, for our listeners online. Hearing, so, you know, taking a walk in nature and listening to the sound of the leaves crunching under your feet, or the drip of snow and ice that's melting. Listening to music that is really calming for you. Or sometimes if you're angry, listening to music that makes you really angry and just getting it out, right? So self-soothing, maybe with some things that, you know, are in line with your emotions. So smell is, I think, one of the best senses that we have, and it's the most closely tied and salient sometimes with our emotion. So baking, or even if you don't have anything to bake, just putting water and vanilla and cinnamon on a stovetop and turning it on and letting your house get that smell. Lighting a candle and opening a window, smelling the fresh air, even if the temperature isn't something that you'd like. Taste is really about savoring and noticing the taste. So, you know, noticing a single piece of candy or sipping on a cup of tea, something soothing. Touch is another one, I think, along with smell, that can be very salient, very powerful. So taking a hot shower or bath. Our pets are wonderful. So, you know, petting your animals and really paying attention to what it feels like physically, and then what that means for you emotionally. Hugging someone that you care about, and then deep breaths. So if you're able to take a deep breath even just now, you kind of notice that I feel like I wasn't really breathing before. So once you take that breath, you can actually feel your chest expand. You can feel your stomach expand, and it feels different when you pay attention to it. than when you don't. And so the best way I like to think about the self-soothing skill is just get out of your mind and come to your senses. So pick a sense, pick something that really works well for you, and have it be something that's a go-to skill to use to practice that compassion and kindness towards yourself. And gratitude. So if you're getting out of your mind and coming to your senses and reflecting upon what that kind of felt like, I can imagine it would probably feel really good to take a deep breath. And, you know, depending on your medical status, recognize what that felt like to take that breath, and maybe how it feels different from in the past. Or, you know, to smell the smell of the outside if you've been in the hospital for a really long time. And then finally, this is my absolute favorite skill, and we're going to practice it together, all of us here in the room. And if you're online, you get to practice it and not feel self-conscious, because it's the half smile. And it's meant to be something that's just for yourself, but we can kind of debate that together. So this is actually something that people are told to do if they're feeling really distressed. Distressed in quotations, meaning an emotion that we don't like. But I kind of use it all the time, even just to take a moment to kind of get back to myself. So it's the idea that we don't really notice what our faces look like until we pay attention to it. So let's start by everybody relaxing your face from the very top of your head all the way down your face and down into your jaw. And you might even notice your eyebrows move around a little bit. You didn't notice that you were scrunching or tensing those. Sometimes people notice their teeth have been clenched, or, you know, you're kind of moving your mouth around. So relaxing your entire face, and then letting both corners of your mouth rise up just slightly. So the two corners of your mouth, your lips, go up just slightly, just so you can feel them, right? Nobody's rating that this is truly a half smile. You are rating yourself on the half smile if it's happening. And then finally, thinking about what that feels like, and then adopting what we would call a serene facial expression. So what it feels like for you to present as serene, right? So mine kind of looks like this. You probably can't tell too much of a difference. I feel it though, right? I feel that little kind of half smile happening. And if you practice it enough, it can kind of be like a go-to thing that you pull out of your back pocket for a moment where maybe you have to stand up in front of a group of people and give a talk. Or, you know, maybe you've got a doctor's appointment that you're not really looking forward to. It's kind of walking the walk of what it can feel like to, you know, train your brain to feel calm through your facial expressions. So this one's my favorite one. But I would argue, you know, that depending on probably the intensity of your half smile, but also the serene expression, you probably present yourself as someone who's open, inviting, pleasant, and perhaps others might read that as something that they would feel comfortable engaging with you. So it's kind of a double whammy where, again, you're doing something for yourself, but you're also doing something that might feel a little pro-social. I've just got a couple more here. Looks like we're locked up. Well, I'll say this at least. So, you know, kind of in closing, thinking about what are those things that exist for you that feel really good, and where are those places where it doesn't quite exist? And what sort of things are you willing to try to be able to practice so that you can do that reflection and see where you can build more of those things into your everyday life? Okay, and with that, I want to acknowledge the National Kidney Foundation and MCW and Frederick Hospital, and then also all of our patients and families who honestly kind of give me a little bit of tips and tricks myself, the things that can work and when they can work. And then finally, the ultimate act of kindness, I would encourage everybody that's listening to consider becoming an organ donor. And the following are some links that exist here in Wisconsin, but I'm sure you can access the website at the National Kidney Foundation wherever you're living, and they can give you some information on how to do that. All right, and with that, I'll take some questions. Yeah.
Well, I've got a question. I mean, the way I look at happiness is a degree of contentment.
Mm. Yeah.
And I seem to be able to handle it that way than to say, I'm happy. I don't feel happy. I haven't been happy for a while. But I am, to a degree, contented.
Yeah. So the question is, you know, how do we really define happiness? And sometimes people vary on degrees of intensity, it would be fair to say, from, you know, not happy at all to maybe content somewhere in the middle to just absolutely ecstatic on the other end. And that's exactly, I would agree with you that that's exactly the way that our emotions work. So our emotions fluctuate in intensity, you know, along a spectrum. So a 0 to 10 is the way that we easily rate things. They also vary in terms of frequency. So how often they actually occur and at what intensity. And then in terms of like the coming back around thing. So if you can kind of think of a wave where there's highs and lows, nobody is ever 100% at, you know, a 5 out of 10 forever. I would argue there would be slight fluctuations and across multiple emotions. But the thing of your question that I think is really interesting is this idea that it's back to that sample size of 1, right? So what means a lot for you in your emotional experience? And it sounds like contentment is something that you're content with, or that, you know, is something that's meaningful in terms of your emotional experience day to day.
It's good for now.
Okay.
So that's how I'm living. But I don't want to just be contented for the next however much longer I have.
Okay.
So I want to rise above being, let's say, a 3 out of 10 contented. I can live with that for now.
Yeah.
But that's not my long-term goal.
So the comment was that the level of contentment isn't something that you want to stay at forever, that you would like to be able to get to a place where you can, sounds like, have maybe increased frequency and higher intensity of that emotion. And so I think the best way to practice, and typically this is something that we talk about in terms of the opposite of happiness, so depression, feeling kind of sad and down, is the idea of behavior activation. So getting active, getting up and doing, you know, the things that you tend to enjoy, making sure that you're doing enough of those, and potentially trying something new. So trying something like increasing the kindness towards others or increasing the kindness towards yourself, either in the reflection that you use when you do those things or even in the frequency that you do them. And it sounds like you've got really good insight about what your experience feels like. So having that time to reflect and maybe move the puzzle pieces around to try something new and see if you can basically build an equation that looks like something that you'd like to be at for now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Have you heard about the mindfulness thing before tonight? Or are some of the other techniques that Dr. Price is talking about?
So the question was, have you heard about mindfulness before? And so we're kind of getting on the topic of mindfulness.
No, I've not heard too much about that, no.
Well, I think a lot of the stuff that she has in here are things that, there's a lot more information available on them. Mm-hmm. It would be good to check into something. Because there are things that can be done.
Yeah, and the comment was that a lot of the content, and that's the case. So a lot of the content that's in the talk does really reference either mindfulness or some Eastern philosophy kinds of mindfulness related skills that make you really focus on the present. So not the past that I'm kind of upset about or ruminating about, and not the future that I'm super worried about, but just here in the moment. And now in this moment. And now in this moment. You know, and really being present. And you said those words yourself. So right now, this is where I'm good at. And I wonder about now and now. And so what mindfulness can help with is really recognizing the now and your internal experience of what that feels like. And then being able to think about some skills that are related to maybe physiologically what you're doing, deep breathing, focusing on your senses to calm the mind and be able to kind of move along to the next moment. Yeah.
Do you have any strategies for how to deflect when someone else isn't kind? Like, and I don't know if that's even the right word, but
Yeah.
I find myself like either observing someone that's not kind to someone else or whatever, and it started to vex me. I don't know if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
It does
but
make
yes,
sense.
How do you, it just seems, I don't know if anyone else feels that way, but I just sometimes want to say, just that's not
Be nice.
a kind of, be nice.
Yeah.
And so I really struggle sometimes. I think I'm responsible for my own behavior, obviously. But do I have a responsibility? I mean, maybe if I'm a parent or grandparent, but like, do I have a responsibility on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah.
I don't know. How do we make kind of, you know, a kind environment, whether it's work or in a group I'm in or.
Yeah. So the question was, how do you manage when you, or feel like you want to deflect when someone else around you isn't really being that kind and you're working on kindness? And especially like you mentioned, when you either find that you're seeing that kind of around you during the day, or you find that it really impacts how you're feeling. You're feeling more distressed, you're feeling frustrated, angry. I can imagine there might be a whole host of things that you might feel. So a couple ideas. I'm sort of a big believer that you've kind of got to do that reflection. So you need to really look internally and think about how it does affect you. And there's typically a lot of options, right? But depending on the relationship with the person, it's tough to figure out if, you know, do I need to say something to my boss? Or, you know, should I say something to this stranger? Or, you know, can I say something to my brother or sister? Because they should know better than to not do those things. But being able to think about also how you're presenting yourself. So depending on what the situation might be, maybe if you're half smiling, for example, or inviting kindness, people might, you know, read that in a way that feels inviting or that feels like they can, you know, reflect upon what might have happened. But sometimes we get in these situations, and depending on, you know, your own internal stuff, sometimes we have to kind of place some boundaries in place so that we can work on ourselves. You know, so this probably isn't something I should approach right now, but I'm kind of upset about it. So maybe I'll take a walk and kind of come back. Or maybe the best thing to do is to be direct and to have a conversation when I'm a little bit more calm and I'm not so upset. But, you know, it can be frustrating when you feel like, you know, I want to live in a place that feels kind and have kindness around me, and I don't necessarily always see that. Yeah.
Well, just as a follow-up, if do people, if they observe kindness, might that be a model for them?
Absolutely.
So if I'm always, whenever I see Carol, saying hello, but somebody else in the, let's say the office doesn't get the drift.
Yeah.
Does just kind of being really consistent.
Consistency for sure, and especially in small group kind of environments, we really, without even being cognizant of it, we really kind of pick up off of the behaviors and especially the social behaviors of others. So absolutely. Being able to, create an environment that, invites kindness, invites curiosity or questions. People can feel comfortable coming up to you, meaning they can be themselves. You can form a genuine relationship or connection. All of those things can be important. Modeling can be huge. Yeah.
One of the other challenges I find is, and sort of playing off that whole contentment issue, and a little bit of what Cindy was talking about, is trying to live within the reality of our situations, whether it be health concerns, whether it be, whatever life situations we're in.
Yeah.
And trying to find some happiness, some contentment within that. But every once in a while, I'm a pretty reflective person, and every once in a while, I stop and go, you know what? I seem to have forgotten. I mean, I certainly know how to be kind. I know how to be generous. I know how to be gracious.
Yeah.
But sometimes joy gets lost.
Mm.
And stopping and going, what does bring you joy?
Yeah.
And certainly some of the things that you talked about, sometimes it's the smell. Just thinking, my sister's here, there's certain smells of childhood that just bring a lot of joy, wet pavements.
Yeah.
Reminds me of something like that. And there's little things that can bring, certain smells. There's different things.
Smells for sure.
Sometimes stopping and, even as you were talking, like exploring something. One of the things I know for me is trying to explore my creativity. And, and then it's so easy getting caught up, and you're like grown, I'm sure, with being so involved in trying to do for others that all of a sudden I've eliminated time for myself, even though those other things bring me a lot of comfort and a lot of joy in that I'm doing good. But all of a sudden, there's something inside me that gets lost. And there's a certain joy that gets lost.
Yeah.
That gets caught up in contentment. And how to stop sometimes and like, how do I seek joy? I mean, I'm not asking you a question.
Yeah, no.
But just, saying to myself, how do I seek joy? What brings me happiness? And can I take that time for myself when I get so other directed?
Yeah.
Say, what is nurturing? Even beyond contentment. Beyond a certain kind of contentment living within my situation.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent question. I think it is a question. So the question was, sometimes there's a challenge with finding the joy and kind of getting stuck in contentment, especially in the context of, living in the reality that we're living in, your own reality, or, doing a lot for others and finding that you're not necessarily having time or putting time towards yourself. And I have a slide actually that answers that exact question. We must have been, so my favorite slide, even more than the half smile. I know I might have lied before, and I know Cindy has seen this. This is something that is about acceptance. So the idea that it kind of is what it is. And saying that doesn't necessarily mean that you're pushing away from what else it could be. But this is something called a turning the mind skill. And you can imagine, you're kind of walking along that line and you end up in the middle of this fork in the road. And you really have two options. You can stay on the road that you're on, remain content, and it's perfectly fine to do so. You can follow the reality that is in the moment. Or you can kind of accept the reality as it truly is, which is, I'm struggling with, feeling only content. I wonder if I could feel something else. and I'm just content right now. How can I accept that and have that be the reality that it is? You know, for whatever the reality, situation, or context is for you, whether it's a medical illness or life stressors or, you know, all kinds of other things that can come up. But the idea behind this skill is not that you have to take a different road, right? You don't need to turn down the acceptance path and, like, you know, run it 75 miles an hour and get somewhere. The idea is to stand at that fork in the road and just kind of turn your mind towards the idea of what it would be like to accept. And almost the idea of, if I were content right now, you know, or if I could be content with contentment, what would that look like? Or I wonder if I could be like just a little bit happier, wonder what that would look like for me. And if I had to walk the walk of a 4 out of 10, how would that look? And I wonder if I could turn my mind towards the idea of not only accepting things for what they are, but being willing to work to try something even just a touch different, as opposed to getting in these moments where we kind of reject things as they are. I don't want to be just content. I'm not just content, right? Does that kind of make sense, this idea of turning the mind and just even kind of holding two things at the same time? I'm content and I'd like to feel joy. Wonder what that could look like. Yeah.
You talked about just kind of living in the now, kind of forget about the past and the future. But we're talking to people who the future seems like death, and the way for that call, you can't not think about the future.
Absolutely, yeah.
Your life is in that call and that future.
Yeah.
Life and death situation. But it's impossible, I think, for me it was, to not think about the future, what it's going to hold. Am I going to be alive? Am I going to get the heart?
Yeah.
And, I don't think anybody here disagree with that. Waiting for that call is, you're 41 years old, you should probably remember everything about it.
Yeah.
Well, and interesting that you said that, because I have a friend, and he said, how do you wake up every day not knowing if, my God, something could happen to your kidney today? Because you can't think like that. You have to go on every day, because things could happen anywhere to anyone. But he said, but you're different. I'm like, well, no, I'm not different. But, you know, it was that exact thing. It was one horrible year before I had my transplant. Then it took a while after I had the transplant to say, you know what, I'm going to be okay. And you do have ups and downs, and you have a lot of them. And when you get really down, you got to pull yourself up, because you do feel so much better. Yeah. And, you know, you get that number calling. I don't know if you're all afraid or not, you know, the 805, you're like, oh, who's calling me? What was wrong with my blood work? And then sometimes they're just checking in to see how your procedure went or whatever.
Yeah.
But, you know, we do live a different life. I don't think I'm different, but we live our life a little differently. So.
Yeah, and the question was, it's challenging, especially for transplant, especially when you're waiting for transplant, to be able to not worry about the future, waiting for the call, or thinking about the past, or thinking about even your current situation and how stressful it might be. And we had another comment from the audience that, you know, that's something that definitely does happen. And at some point she recognized that she was able to just kind of get up and go through the days, and what sounds like a lot of accepting in the moment. I kind of don't like the word acceptance, because it really puts a period at the end of the sentence and says that's how it's supposed to be, accepting in the moment. I can't understand. I can only appreciate that feeling of, you know, worrying and wondering what the future will hold. And I always kind of do the and thing. We can have two things at the same time. There's also this idea that even for just this one single moment, there's room to focus on, for example, the smell of a candle. And I know that's a really simplistic kind of comparison to make to getting the call for a transplant. And I also think it's something that can definitely calm a busy mind and work with a busy mind, because your mind would likely be the busiest it could be in those moments that you're waiting for that call to come in. And the idea is less about not worrying about the future and more about making your experience in this moment as optimal as it could be, even though there's the busy mind and even though there's the fear and the worry. Does that answer your question?
The sickness takes over sometimes, so you can't do it. You have to sort of like to do it, but make it.
Yeah.
I mean, now I try and give it back as much as I can.
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy when I'm out in both fishing. Right? But at that point, even back then when I could do certain things, you were always thinking, well, what's going to happen? Who's that call? Who's that call?
Yeah.
You turn that on with the cycle.
Yeah. And so the comment was that back when he was waiting for the transplant, it was really hard to turn those thoughts off. And even when he was doing the things that brought him a lot of joy and a lot of pleasure, those thoughts still stuck around. But I also want to normalize that too, that, you know, a lot of these kind of blanket statements about, you know, staying in the moment and not worrying about the future and not worrying about the past will look very, very different depending on the amount of stress and the situation that you're in. It's normal. And that it's also expected that there would be a little bit of a bounce back and a new normal that would happen after transplant. So being able to balance all of those things together, but also, you know, you gotta, if you weren't worried about calls from the hospital, I think the doctors would be worried, right? You've got to be on top of those sorts of things. And that's the thing too, is now your environment is, well, I've got to keep my phone with me. I'm waiting for phone calls. I'm waiting for my lab results to come in. Do I want to look in my chart and see what my lab results are? I can't decide if that's how I want to keep living my life these days. So it's finding that new normal and new balance of what you want your daily experience to look like, and also what you're willing to try to see if it can impact those happiness things we talked about. Self-esteem, mood, you know, self-actualization, liking the quality of life that you have. Other questions?
Great. Well, maybe Jenessa can stay around for
Yeah.
a few minutes to talk, and we certainly can. But speaking of